What if architecture no longer touched the earth? What if the ground itself were no longer necessary? You hear waves lapping, the wind sweeping across an open field, faint echoes of construction in the distance. This is the architect who wanted to erase the ground. For as long as humans have built, the ground has defined where and how we live. It has anchored our homes, our cities, our monuments. But what happens when we refuse that anchor? When we lift buildings into air, float them on water, or suspend them in voids? The ground stops being the starting point and instead becomes something to escape, to rethink, to erase. Imagine a house that refuses to sit on the earth. It does not sprawl or burrow. It lifts itself up and lets air and people pass below. This is Le Corbusier's Villa Savoye, a white box raised on slender concrete columns in a field outside Paris. The house looks light. It treats the ground as a shared plane, not a private base. It leaves the grass, the path, and the shadows intact. Le Corbusier called those columns pilotis. They carry the load, so the walls do not have to. With the structure off the ground, the space under the house becomes public. You can walk or park there. The damp strip that most houses claim as theirs turns into a free zone. Children can play in shade. The house hovers and makes room for life. This lift is the first of his 5 points of architecture. The second is the free plan. Since the pilotis take the weight, the interior walls can shift or vanish. Rooms can open to each other. You can change the layout as needs change. A hall can become a studio. The plan stops being a fixed grid and starts being a set of choices. The third point is the free facade. Here too, structure and skin part ways. The columns sit inside like bones, so the outer face can open or close as the design asks. The wall no longer tells you where a beam sits. It serves light, view, and weather. The fourth point is the ribbon window. A band of glass runs across the facade. Each room gets an even wash of light. You see the horizon, not only a small framed view. Inside, you read the day by the move of light. The fifth point is the roof garden. The flat roof is not a cap you ignore. It's a place to sit, plant, and look out. In Villa Savoye, a ramp leads you there. You climb from the shaded ground, through the open plan, to the sky. The house trades the small front yard for a roof court with sun and wind. Taken together, the points make a clear idea. Remove the house from the soil and free the ground for common use. Le Corbusier did not hate the earth. He wanted to stop wasting it with heavy walls and deep foundations where they were not needed. Lift the box, clear the plain, share the land. Think of a market town that floods each spring. A row of pilotis can keep homes dry and keep paths open. Think of a clinic that serves many groups over time. A free plan lets rooms glow or shrink. Think of a library on a small block. Roof garden returns trees to a paved street. These are simple, physical gains. They arise from the way loads move and people move. Villa Savoye shows the idea with clarity. You arrive under the house, not at a porch. The pilotis draw a soft grid. The ground stays open. A ramp takes you up as if you walk through a thought. You rise into a bright room. The ribbon windows lay the landscape on the wall like a scroll. A solid core holds service parts, while walls slip and fold around it. Why call this erasing the ground? Because the ground stops serving one owner alone. It becomes a shared layer. Le Corbusier raised the house to say that land can host many acts at once. A mower passes under. A delivery rolls through. Wind cools the slab. Trees can grow without fear of blocked roots. Birds nest. The building no longer locks the site. It hovers and negotiates with it. This change is not only practical, it is also a break with how houses claim status. Many old villas sat on plinths or steps, like small temples. They pressed their weight into the earth to show power. Villa Savoye flips that script. It floats to show care. It does not crown the hill. It draws the hill under itself. The symbol shifts from rule to release. This stance ties to modernism's tools. The domino frame, a stack of concrete slabs on columns, made free plans and facades fast. Cars needed clear ground and smooth turns. Urban hygiene called for sun and air. The 5 points meet these needs. If you can lift, lift when the site will gain from light, air, and flow. Picture a school on a tight lot. The pilotees hold the rooms above a shaded court. Kids play under shelter from heat or rain. After hours, the community sets up tables for a small market. Now picture a clinic in a floodplain. The slab sits high on columns. When waters rise, boats dock under the building. Care goes on. When the waters drop, the open ground dries fast. In both cases, the building steps back and lets more happen. Some hear in this a loss of roots. If the house does not touch earth, does it lose its bond with place? Le Corbusier answered with the promenade. The ramp and terrace script a slow meeting with sky, wind, and view. The ground is not gone. It is read in a new way. You stand under the house and feel shade and breeze. You rise and see the field roll past the ribbon windows. You reach the roof and face the weather. The idea has limits. Lifting costs money and skill. Not all soils accept thin columns. Cold places need careful design to avoid heat loss. Thoughtless use of the points can make bland boxes. The core move stays plain and strong. Move weight to pilotees. Free the plan. Open the facade. Stretch light across rooms. Give the roof back to people and plants. And keep the ground as a commons. Keep building, but stop pinning the land down. Let paths pass. Let floods pass. Let air move. Let light spread. The house can step off the ground and still belong to it. Dalibor Vesely wrote about the ground as more than a surface to build on. He saw it as the first point of reference for human life. When a person stands, walks, or lies down, the ground holds them. When they look out, the horizon tells them where they are in space. To Vesely, the ground is not only physical, it is also symbolic. It carries memory, belonging, and permanence. It links us to the past and offers stability for the future. Without ground, the world would feel unmoored. The ground shapes orientation. Think of the child learning to walk. Each step comes with balance, a test of weight against the floor. The child looks down, then up, and learns that ground holds them steady. Adults rely on the same sense. We do not stare at the earth each time we move, yet we trust it to stay firm. Pavement, grass, or sand changes how we feel, but the common thread is support. Architecture has always made use of this. Temples rest on plinths. Houses spread foundations. Paths cut into fields. These gestures reassure us that space is anchored. Vesely argued that this anchoring is also mental. To lose it is to lose more than a place to stand. It is to lose meaning. When we speak of someone grounded, we mean stable. When we bury our dead, we return them to the soil. The word itself suggests permanence. In this sense, the ground is not only the site of daily life, it is also a metaphor for truth, tradition, and continuity. Architecture that rises above or ignores the earth must wrestle with what it leaves behind. Now imagine what happens when this assumption is challenged. A building lifted on pilatus, a tower that floats above a plaza, or even a virtual room in a headset lacks the usual weight of earth. Do we feel freed or disoriented? For some, the absence of ground brings excitement. The house in the air seems lighter, more modern, more open to new uses. For others, it unsettles. They long for the touch of stone steps or the feel of earth under a wall. A clear example lies in raised houses in flood zones. In Southeast Asia, Malay houses stand on timber stilts. This lifts them from damp soil and protects them from water and pests. The floor is above, but the shaded area below is also used for work and play. Here, the ground is not erased, but redefined. People still orient themselves to it. They gather under the house, tie animals there, or rest in the cool shade. The architecture both acknowledges the earth and holds it at a careful distance. Vesely would point to this as a way the ground continues to frame human life, even when the main rooms are lifted. Compare this with a modern office tower. The first floors may be glass walls that give the illusion of weightlessness. The ground floor becomes a lobby that tries to erase the sense of base. Visitors step from sidewalk to interior without clear threshold. The building seems to deny its own footprint. Here, the anchor is not felt. Some may see this as freedom from old ties. Others may feel that something essential has been lost. The ground also organizes ritual. Festivals, markets, and protests take place on plazas and fields. People measure space in relation to these surfaces. The square at the center of a town is not only empty land. It is a stage for collective meaning. To lift activity away from it is to risk breaking that shared anchor. Consider a public building raised on a podium with steps. The climb itself signals entry, a moment of transition from common earth to civic space. Without such gestures, the sense of occasion may fade. Vesely's thought reminds us that orientation is not only functional, but also symbolic. What if the ground disappears in more radical ways? In virtual reality, there is no soil, no horizon, no gravity unless programmed. You can float, fly, or walk on surfaces that shift. The body still stands in a room, but the eyes see something else. Users record wonder, but also nausea or unease. The absence of stable ground confuses the senses. The mind longs for a floor that does not move. This shows how deep the link between ground and meaning runs. Even in simulated worlds, we need some reference plane to trust. Metaphors of the ground appear in language across cultures. We speak of common ground when people agree. We say lose your footing when someone fails. We stand our ground to resist change. These phrases show that soil and surface symbolize stability. Architecture that challenges this metaphor must take care. It may open imaginative worlds, but it also risks confusion. A floating house may feel like freedom to one person and like exile to another. Permanence is at the heart of this tension. A house rooted in stone suggests endurance. It tells the story of generations. A house on stilts or columns speaks of adaptation, flexibility, and change. Neither is wrong, but each implies a different way of living with time. Vesely might argue that to deny the ground altogether is to deny continuity. Yet he might also admit that imagination thrives when the normal order is suspended. The challenge is to balance both. To float and still belong, to adapt and still anchor. Picture a traveler entering a new city. If streets spread across a plain, the ground itself guides them. Hills, rivers, and paths form a natural map. Now imagine a city of raised walkways and towers. Orientation shifts to signs, lifts, and bridges. The earth beneath may vanish from view. The traveler may feel lost, even if technology guides their steps. Vesely's point is clear. The ground is not only support, but also orientation. Without it, our sense of place changes. In building practice, this means that design choices carry weight beyond structure. A ramp, a step, a courtyard, or a stilt does more than move bodies. It sets how people relate to the earth. Even when a house floats, the experience of climbing, descending, or looking down ties it back to the soil. Architects who erase the ground must still provide some way for users to regain their bearings. The ground, in Vesely's thought, holds more than physical mass. It holds the memory of those who lived before and the hope of those who will come. To lift life away from it is both a technical act and a symbolic one. It asks whether we can reimagine meaning without losing our anchor. Some designs succeed by letting the ground remain visible, usable, or shared, even when the main structure is raised. Others fail by denying its presence. The question is not whether we can build without ground, but whether we can live without it. Lebbeus Woods was an architect who built more in thought and drawing than in bricks and mortar. His work asked what architecture could be if it were not bound by the ground or by fixed purpose. He imagined what he called free space. In his terms, free space was not a void waiting to be filled. It was space alive with possibility, space not determined in advance by walls, floors, and rules. He believed architecture could offer conditions rather than solutions, frameworks rather than prescriptions. Instead of dictating how people must live or move, it could invite them to shape their own experience. To grasp what he meant, it helps to think of how most buildings control their users. A school lays out classrooms, halls, and stairwells. A house defines bedrooms, kitchens, and living rooms. Each room has a set purpose, and the ground beneath assures its permanence. Woods questioned why this had to be so. He saw space as open to constant change, not tied to foundations or fixed programs. His drawings show suspended platforms, floating walls, and scaffolds that seem to grow and twist like living organisms. These are not plans for stability, but visions of motion. They reject the comfort of ground in favor of chance and choice. His series War and Architecture, made during the conflicts in Sarajevo, shows fragments of buildings torn by violence. Instead of restoring them to their original forms, Woods proposed adding frameworks that opened new ways of living. Jagged structures pierce old facades, scaffolds weave through ruins, platforms hang in broken shells. These designs do not erase destruction. They accept it as part of the city's memory. Free space here means room for survivors to adapt, to reclaim broken places without pretending nothing happened. The ground is not a base for repair, but a witness to change. In his light pavilion in Chengdu, which was built with the help of architect Christoph A. Kumpusch, Woods explored similar ideas. The pavilion is a vertical field of platforms, stairs, and beams inside a tower. Visitors move without clear guidance. There are no signs telling them where to go, no fixed path to follow. The space is about exploration and self-made order. You walk on glass, steel, and air. The ground is far below, but you feel suspended in a new kind of frame. This structure embodies free space as Woods imagined it, a place where use is never fully prescribed. What makes this concept radical is its refusal of foundation. In most traditions, the ground is the guarantee of meaning. A temple sits on a base. A house roots itself in soil. Woods turned away from this. He used the void itself as material. His lines suggest networks of tension cables, scaffolds, and lattices that hold space but do not settle it. The user, not the ground, becomes the anchor. The act of moving, climbing, resting, or looking gives the space its form. This shift removes determinism. The architect does not control every detail of behavior. Instead, architecture becomes a partner in improvisation. His speculative drawings push this even further. Some show cities that hover above deserts. Others depict structures lodged in mountains like parasites. None of them seem to belong to their sites in the usual way. They cling, float, or intrude. They do not merge into a single ground, but instead fracture it. The eye sees not a stable base, but a field of relations. This links back to the idea of erasure. By refusing the natural ground, Woods erases assumptions about permanence and belonging. He frees architecture to be temporal, dynamic, and unstable. To understand how radical this is, consider how people usually relate to space. In a house, the floor assures that one can walk. The ceiling guarantees shelter. Everything is predictable. Woods imagined conditions where nothing is given, where space is defined by constant negotiation. In a free space, you do not rely on ground. You rely on interaction. The hand on a rail, the foot on a step, the pause on a platform. All these acts make the architecture real. Without people, his structures are almost skeletal. With them, they come alive. This view was not only about form, but also about freedom. Woods distrusted systems that imposed order, whether political, social, or architectural. He saw free space as a way to resist control. By removing fixed ground, he removed the guarantee of hierarchy. A space without a foundation cannot be owned in the same way as one planted firmly in the soil. It must be shared, tested, and redefined each time it is used. For him, this was liberation. It was a way of opening architecture to the unpredictable energy of life. One could argue that such visions are impractical, that buildings must stand on solid earth and follow codes. Woods knew this. He did not pretend to offer standard solutions. His work was more like philosophy in drawing form, but his influence is felt in how architects think about flexibility, adaptability, and temporality. In disaster zones, for example, temporary shelters often echo his ideas. They rely on light frames, movable parts, and quick assembly. They do not claim permanence, but offer room for survival and adaptation. In this sense, free space enters the real world not as fantasy, but as method. Seen alongside the idea of erasing ground, Woods's free space is a logical extension. If the ground is the anchor of meaning, then to erase it is to demand new anchors. His answer was interaction itself. The user becomes the ground. The act of inhabiting becomes the foundation. This is why his drawings often look unfinished. They are not static objects, but invitations to imagine living differently. He was less concerned with what architecture is than with what it could let people do. The ground disappears, but life does not. It shifts, adapts, and finds new ways to root itself in space without soil. Stilt houses are among the oldest and most widespread answers to the challenge of living with unstable or hostile ground. They appear in Southeast Asia, Oceania, South America, and even parts of Europe. Though the cultures are different, the logic is often the same. When people build above the soil on timber or bamboo posts, they gain protection from water, pests, and heat. They also create an architecture that floats in a state of balance, never fully tied to the earth below. These houses are modest in appearance, but rich in meaning. They remind us that ground is not always a stable partner, and that architecture often begins by questioning how close we must stay to the soil. In Southeast Asia, the stilt house is a familiar sight along riverbanks and coastlines. In the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, entire villages rise above floodplains on tall posts. When the water swells during rainy season, the houses remain dry. Underneath, boats can pass, animals can rest, and air can flow. The house is not a sealed box, but part of a system that adapts to seasonal change. The posts themselves are made of wood chosen for strength and resistance to rot, often local hardwoods that can last many years. The space between floor and ground also provides ventilation, cooling the interior during hot weather. The design is practical, but it also expresses a way of life that accepts water as constant companion rather than enemy. In Indonesia and Malaysia, the rumah panggung or raised house is common in both rural and coastal regions. These houses rest on timber piles driven deep into the soil. The space beneath is often used for storage, animals, or social gatherings. In many communities, this undercroft becomes an active part of daily life, shaded and cooler than open ground. The separation between living floor and earth is also a cultural boundary. It marks the house as protected space, distinct from the muddy, shifting, or insect-rich ground. Termites, snakes, and floodwaters are kept at bay by height, while the human realm of cooking, sleeping, and family life floats above. The design also makes relocation easier. A house built on stilts can sometimes be moved by lifting its frame and carrying it to a new site. This mobility reflects an understanding that settlement need not be permanent, that ground can be negotiated rather than owned. The Pacific Islands also show a long tradition of stilt building. In Micronesia and Polynesia, structures on posts rise above lagoons and coastal shallows. These houses face constant exposure to tides and storms. Their elevation offers security from flooding, while their lightweight materials allow them to be rebuilt quickly after damage. Bamboo, palm, and thatch create frames that can bend or break without threatening survival. The goal is not permanence, but resilience. The house is an island above the island, a second layer of habitation that shifts with nature rather than resisting it. In some traditions, raised meeting houses also carry ceremonial meaning. They symbolize connection to the sky and separation from profane ground, suggesting that elevation itself holds cultural value beyond simple function. In South America, the Amazon basin hosts countless variations of stilt dwellings. Along rivers that rise and fall by several meters each year, houses built on posts are the only way to remain dry. Communities in Brazil, Peru, and Colombia construct palafitos, wooden structures perched above seasonal floods. These houses hover above a landscape that transforms each season from forest floor to water world. The gap below acts as storage or workspace when dry and becomes a waterway when flooded. Children play in boats under their homes, and fishing happens from the doorway. The architecture does not deny the flood, but adapts to it, showing how built form can live with extreme cycles. Here again, stilts provide both practical protection and a symbolic stance. Life need not conquer the river, it can rise above it. Even in Europe, traces of stilt traditions remain. Archaeological sites around alpine lakes show that prehistoric communities built pile dwellings above water. Posts driven into lake beds supported platforms and huts. The reasons were similar: safety from flooding, pests, and animals, as well as access to fishing. These ancient houses remind us that elevation is not limited to tropical or equatorial zones. Wherever ground proves uncertain or unsafe, people have lifted their homes to find security and comfort. The symbolism of stilt houses runs deeper than function. By choosing to rise above the soil, communities express a refusal to merge completely with the ground. The earth is unstable, wet, and sometimes dangerous. To hover above it is to recognize its power while creating a layer of distance. This balance between dependence and separation gives stilt houses a unique character. They are not fortresses sealed off from nature, nor are they tents that vanish with each season. They are adaptive compromises, negotiating with ground and water in ways that keep life flexible. The posts themselves become symbols of this negotiation. They are slender, temporary, and replaceable, yet together they create stability. The house above them seems light, provisional, and balanced, as if aware that permanence is an illusion. The way these houses are built also reinforces community ties. Raising a stilt house often requires collective effort, with neighbors gathering to set posts, lift beams, and assemble walls. This shared work reflects the social nature of adaptation. No single household can fully resist floods or pests alone, but together a village can float above danger. The underfloor space often becomes a place for gatherings, trade, and conversation, binding people through architecture. The house is not just a family shelter, but a node in a web of relations. Its lifted form, both practical and symbolic, mirrors the collective resilience of those who live within it. Seen in this light, stilt houses challenge the idea that architecture must root itself in solid ground. They show another path, one where the ground is present but not absolute, where life hovers in equilibrium rather than sinks into permanence. They remind us that to erase the ground is not always an act of denial, but sometimes an act of respect. By refusing to settle completely, these houses acknowledge the power of soil, water, and insects. They do not claim mastery, but offer balance. In their quiet way, they propose a vision of architecture that does not conquer Earth, but learns how to live just above it. The Malay house is one of the clearest examples of how vernacular architecture develops wisdom from lived experience. Built from timber and bamboo, lifted on stilts, and roofed with steep gables of thatch or tiles, it is not a fixed monument, but a flexible structure designed for climate, culture, and land. Its design emerges from centuries of adaptation to the equatorial environment, where heat, humidity, and seasonal floods shape daily life. To understand it is to see how a house can be more than shelter. It becomes a way of living with nature rather than against it, and of treating the ground not as an inert base, but as a living partner that demands care and respect. The timber stilts form the most visible feature. By raising the floor above the soil, the house stays dry during monsoon floods. The stilts also lift the living areas above mud, insects, and snakes. Air circulates freely under the floor, cooling the interior in a hot and humid climate. This design is not decorative, but necessary. In many villages, the space below the house becomes a shaded working area. Children play there, women weave mats, men repair tools, and animals find shelter. The house becomes a layered environment: the ground for activity, the elevated floor for family life, and the high roof for air to escape. Each layer responds to natural forces without heavy machinery or complex systems. The logic is simple, but the effect is elegant. The roof of the Malay house is steep and long. This form sheds tropical rain quickly and protects the walls from water damage. Inside, the high roof space allows hot air to rise and escape. Openings near the gable ends or under the eaves encourage cross-ventilation. This passive cooling reduces the need for energy or effort. The roof is not just a cover, but an environmental regulator. In traditional practice, the materials, palm thatch or clay tiles, come from the surrounding land. They can be replaced when worn, keeping the house in a cycle of repair and renewal. This use of local resources reflects an ecological balance where the building lives within its environment rather than imposing itself upon it. The walls of the house breathe. They are often made of timber planks fitted loosely, or panels of woven bamboo that allow air to pass. Windows are large, with shutters that swing wide to catch breezes. The interior is never sealed, but porous, open to wind and light. Privacy is managed by partitions rather than by solid barriers. This openness aligns with social life in Malay culture, where hospitality and community matter. A visitor can see the life of the house even from outside, and a family can connect with neighbors through sound and sight. The architecture does not isolate, but connects, using permeability as both environmental and cultural strategy. Adaptability is another strength. The Malay house is modular, built from parts that can be added, removed, or rearranged. A family may start with a small core house and then expand by attaching new rooms or verandas as needs change. Because the structure is of timber frames joined without nails, it can be dismantled and reassembled elsewhere. Entire houses have been moved from one site to another by disassembling the frame, carrying the parts, and rebuilding. In some communities, neighbors gather to literally lift a house and carry it to new ground. This mobility treats the house as temporary and reversible, never fixed permanently to one spot. Ground is not something to conquer, but something to negotiate. If soil erodes, if floods worsen, or if social needs shift, the house can move with them. This flexibility reveals a cultural philosophy. The Malay house does not assert dominance over the land, but rests lightly upon it. The posts touch the soil, but the living floor floats above, leaving the earth surface intact. The materials come from forests and fields, and when the house decays, it returns to them. The design assumes that nothing is permanent, that ground shifts, and that human needs evolve. This acceptance of impermanence contrasts with modern building practice, where concrete foundations anchor structures deeply and permanently. In the Malay approach, reversibility is a virtue. To build lightly is to recognize that the ground itself is alive, with water, roots, and insects moving through it. To dig deep is to disturb that life. To hover above is to respect it. The cultural meaning of the Malay house also lies in how it frames social life. The raised platform becomes the stage for daily rituals, prayers, meals, conversations, and ceremonies. The veranda, often open on one or more sides, serves as a threshold between household and village. Guests are welcome there, shaded and elevated, where hospitality can be expressed without intrusion into private rooms. The spatial order reflects values of openness, respect, and gradual transition from public to private. The ground itself is part of this social order. It is not erased but transformed into a shared domain of play, work, and movement under the raised floor. The architecture mediates between soil and sky, between individual and community, without cutting ties to either. Scenarios make this clearer. Imagine a Malay family during the monsoon season. As water rises around the posts, the house remains dry. The family can still cook, sleep, and gather, while chickens find safety under the floor and boats tie up nearby. The ground is unstable, yet life continues above. Or consider a wedding feast. Guests gather on the veranda, spilling into the shaded space below where food is prepared and shared. The house expands socially without needing permanent halls or extensions. Or picture a family deciding to move after a death or in search of new farmland. The house can be dismantled, carried, and rebuilt, its form renewed in a different place. These scenarios show how design aligns with both ecological and cultural rhythms. The Malay house also demonstrates how architecture can endure without permanence. It is resilient precisely because it does not cling to the ground. Floods, pests, and heat are not fought with heavy barriers, but met with openness, elevation, and breathability. The house trusts in renewal, in community labor, and in materials that return to the earth. It recognizes that the ground beneath is unstable and alive, and it answers by staying light and reversible. This is not a weakness, but a form of wisdom, a way of dwelling that accepts the world as it is, while creating spaces of comfort, identity, and belonging. The shift from traditional stilt houses to visionary megastructures may seem vast, but the connection runs deeper than it first appears. At the root of both lies a desire to loosen the grip of the ground and to build in ways that respond to shifting conditions. The stilt house raises its floor to escape floods and pests. The floating megastructure imagines cities that drift on oceans or hover above landscapes. Both forms treat the earth not as a fixed anchor, but as a changing surface, something to live with, but not necessarily to tie down forever. When seen as part of one long continuum, the vernacular and the visionary share an ethic of flexibility, impermanence, and respect for the environment. The traditional stilt house begins with necessity. In Southeast Asia, Oceania, and South America, people lifted their homes above soil because water, heat, and insects made direct contact with the ground dangerous. The posts allowed air to move beneath the house, which cooled the interior and reduced decay. The ground remained free for farming, walking, or seasonal flooding. This act of lifting life up produced a quiet but radical idea. A house does not need to be fused to the earth to be stable. Instead, it can hover, balanced on supports that leave the land intact. That same principle echoes through architectural experiments many centuries later. In the 20th century, architects began to imagine structures freed not only from soil, but also from traditional urban forms. Le Corbusier, with his pilotis, envisioned cities raised above gardens and highways, allowing air and light to pass freely. Archigram, a group of British architects in the 1960s, sketched walking cities, massive machines with legs that could move across terrain in search of resources. Japanese metabolists proposed capsules and towers that could be added or removed like living organisms. These projects, though futuristic, extend the same principle as the stilt house, buildings that adapt to conditions rather than resist them, buildings that recognize impermanence rather than deny it. The Malay house illustrates how lightness and reversibility can be practical virtues. Its timber frame can be dismantled and reassembled elsewhere, allowing families to move with changing land or social needs. In this mobility, we see a lesson that later visionary projects scale up. Floating cities proposed today in response to climate change echo the same idea. Structures must be portable, adjustable, and renewable. They may not stand forever on one patch of soil, but instead shift with water levels, populations, and resources. What was once village practice becomes, in the visionary imagination, planetary strategy. Consider the example of Buckminster Fuller's geodesic domes. These lightweight structures used minimal material to cover large spans. Fuller also imagined floating cities, buoyed by air or water, that could house thousands without fixing themselves permanently to the ground. His interest in efficiency and adaptability parallels the stilt house builder's concern for economy and survival. The scale differs, but the underlying ethic, do more with less, remain light on the earth, remains consistent. In this way, vernacular design can be read as the seed of visionary speculation. Scenarios bring the continuity into focus. Imagine a small stilt village along the Mekong River. Houses rise on posts, clustered above waterlogged soil, with walkways linking families together. Now imagine a floating city in the Pacific, designed to respond to sea level rise. Both arrangements create community above unstable ground. Both use elevation or buoyancy as defense, and both frame daily life around adaptability. The difference lies in scale and technology, but the lineage of thought is direct. What protects a single household today may inspire how we plan entire populations tomorrow. The theme of impermanence also connects vernacular and visionary forms. Traditional houses accept decay. Bamboo and thatch wear out and must be replaced. Timber frames loosen and are repaired. The building lives through cycles of renewal, never aiming to last forever. This acceptance of impermanence is not weakness, but resilience. Visionary architects, too, often stress modularity and change. Metabolist cities were designed to grow and shrink, with pods replaced like cells in a body. Archigram's walking cities embodied constant motion, never settling permanently. Both traditions assume that stability is not the same as stasis, and that permanence may in fact be brittle. Respect for the environment underlies the connection as well. The Malay house responds to climate by using local materials and passive cooling. It avoids disturbing soil by resting lightly on posts. Visionary projects, when at their best, aim to minimize impact on ecosystems. Floating platforms, modular towers, and air-supported domes all attempt to find ways of living that reduce heavy foundations, sprawl, or irreversible land use. Of course, visionary projects sometimes fail to honor these values, becoming fantasies of domination instead of humility. Yet at their core, the most compelling ones recall vernacular wisdom: build light, adapt constantly, and treat ground as something alive, not inert. It is tempting to think that futuristic visions invent ideas from nothing. In fact, they often rediscover what communities have known for centuries. The thread from stilt houses to megastructures is not linear but resonant. The Malay house whispers the same principles that Fuller shouted with domes and archigram sketched with walking machines. The ground can be stepped back from. Buildings can float, hover, or move. Structures can be light, adaptable, and reversible. The scale expands, the technology shifts, but the continuity of thought holds firm. When we study the lineage in this way, we see that visionary architecture does not emerge in isolation. It grows from traditions that solved practical problems with elegance. Stilt houses were never theory. They were life made durable through adaptation. The futurist projects extend those ideas into imagination, sometimes impractical, but often prophetic. Together they remind us that building is not only about shelter, but about negotiating with the world's instability. From bamboo posts in a floodplain to floating megacities in rising seas, the same wisdom persists. Respect the ground by not clinging to it, and respect the future by staying ready to change. Metabolism was a group of Japanese architects who came together around 1960 with a simple but strong idea: cities should grow and change like living things. They saw buildings not as finished objects, but as systems that could add parts, shed parts, and renew themselves. Kiyonori Kikutake was one of the central figures. Before most people spoke about rising seas or land scarcity, he drew a different map for urban life. His proposal, Marine City, imagined artificial land that floated on the ocean and formed a new kind of settlement. It was not tied to a single shore. It could move, expand, split, or even retire parts of itself when they reached the end of their useful life. Kikutake's Marine City began with platforms at sea. These platforms supported housing, workplaces, farms, and public spaces. Think of them as large structural rafts, engineered for waves and wind, linked into neighborhoods. Each platform held a mix of uses to keep daily life close at hand. Bridges and service corridors tied platforms together so that energy, water, and goods could flow. If a platform no longer met the city's needs, it could be replaced. In some versions of the idea, obsolete units would not become waste. Designers proposed towing them to deep water where they could settle and turn into marine habitat. In this way, the city could evolve without leaving a scar. The metabolists did not draw floating towns only to shock the eye. They were trying to answer very real pressures in post-war Japan: rapid urbanization, limited flat land, and the need to rebuild at scale. Marine City also faced outward to global seas, which Kikutake treated as a new frontier for living space. He proposed vertical cores that rose from the platforms like trunks. Around these cores, residential branches could attach and detach. The image was botanical, but the logic was practical. Families grow and shrink, jobs change, storms and earthquakes strike. A city built as a set of replaceable parts can respond faster than one fixed in concrete and stone. Metabolism's larger projects backed this approach. Kenzo Tange sketched a plan for Tokyo that stretched the city across Tokyo Bay on a branching structure. Kisho Kurokawa built the Nakagin Capsule Tower in 1972 with plug-in housing pods that could, in theory, be swapped. Arata Isozaki, Fumihiko Maki, and others explored clusters, capsules, and megastructures that treated buildings as open systems. Marine City took those ideas offshore. It suggested that land itself could be modular and mobile. In that move, Kikutake made a leap. If the ground is a constraint, make new ground that you can reconfigure. Picture a day in Marine City. A worker walks from a housing platform across a short bridge to a fabrication platform beneath. Aquaculture frames support seaweed and shellfish that feed local markets. Children cross to a school platform that shares space with a clinic and a library. If the school outgrows its site, engineers add a new classroom wing or shift the school to a larger platform. If a storm approaches, the city locks its joints, lowers wind baffles, and rides out the waves. If a platform reaches the end of its design life, a replacement arrives, and the old one is decommissioned in a way that benefits the sea. The routine of a town holds, but the fabric can flex. The strength of this model lies in its acceptance of change. Conventional urban plans assume long cycles and fixed parcels. Streets and blocks last for generations. That stability has value, but it can also trap a city in outdated forms. Marine City asks us to think in shorter pulses. Utility lines plug and unplug. Districts swap places. Work zones and housing zones trade edges as the economy shifts. You do not erase the whole city to update a part. You slide pieces in and out like organ in a living system. Of course, such a vision needs engineering. Platforms must manage buoyancy, balance, and fatigue. Joints must allow motion without failure. Services must route across moving seams. Kikutake's drawings did not solve every detail, but they set the agenda. Later work on very large floating structures, breakwaters, and offshore energy has moved the technical side forward. Modular barges and semi-submersible platforms show how to build at sea and still make maintenance and replacement routine. The idea that parts can retire and new parts can arrive is no longer science fiction. It is how offshore industries already work. Marine City also offers a clear policy stance. Fixing a city to a single geography gives advantage to those who control land. A mobile, modular base redistributes power. Coastal communities that face floods or erosion could rotate public functions to safer waters rather than abandon them. Regions with seasonal work could bring platforms in during peak times and send them out when demand falls. Small nations with limited land could extend their footprint without land reclamation that destroys reefs or wetlands. The city becomes a fleet, steering by need rather than by old borders. Critics might ask about culture and memory on a moving ground. The metabolists answered with two ideas. First, identity can live in structure and pattern, not only in location. A network of cores, bridges, and squares can carry a civic image even when the modules change. Second, memory can take material form. Retired platforms can seed reefs. Old trusses can become public art. Stories attached to the ways a city adapts. In Marine City, place is not a dot on a map. It is the shared practice of keeping a community afloat. The model also invites new forms of stewardship. A platform that supports an energy farm might fund the maintenance of nearby housing. A neighborhood cooperative might own its module and lease dock space from the city. The rules can encourage repair and discourage waste by tying licenses to performance. When a platform reaches the end of its term, the owner must return it in a state fit for reefing or reuse. In this way, the life cycle of built parts lines up with the life cycle of the sea. Now think about climate migration. As seas rise, many low-lying towns face loss of homes and work. A Marine City approach would not wait for disaster. It would stage a gradual shift seaward, bringing small modules online to test services, then scaling up. Fisherfolk could add processing platforms to capture more value locally. Universities could more research labs that study currents, weather, and marine ecology. Tourism could grow in forms that do not pave beaches. Each step builds capacity while keeping options open. If conditions worsen, more platforms join. If conditions improve, some return to shore use or reef duty. Metabolism often drew criticism for its grand scale. But Kikutake's Marine City remains useful because it sets a simple test. Can the city change without breaking itself? The answer offshore is yes, if you design for replacement from the start. Joints, standards, and supply chains make that possible. The reward is urban life unbound from fixed geography, able to follow resources, avoid hazards, and share space with nature. The sea ceases to be a void between lands and becomes the ground of a new kind, open, flexible, and alive. Coastal cities face rising seas and shrinking room to grow. Designers have started to treat water as a place to live rather than a boundary. Several paths have taken shape. Some are speculative and bold. Others are modest and already in use. Together, they draw a clear line from idea to action, build light, float when needed, and close resource loops so communities can thrive without hard land. Vincent Callebaut's lilipad sits at the visionary end. He drew it as a city that looks like a water lily, with a rim that shelters homes and farms, and a central lagoon that gathers rain. The form spreads loads, reduces wave impact, and creates a calm interior harbor. The skin harvests sun and wind. The hull supports tidal and wave devices. Seaweed gardens and aquaculture sit at the edge. Waste streams become inputs. Gray water feeds planted wetlands. Black water flows to digesters, and biogas returns to kitchens. The target population is large enough to feel like a town, small enough to manage as a unit. The plan blends housing, work, schools, clinics, and markets so that daily needs sit within walking distance. You can picture a family living on the rim, with a short walk to a dock, a classroom, and a shared greenhouse. The design answers a hard prompt. Where will climate refugees go when shorelines fail? Lilipad says, go to sea with systems that produce food, power, and fresh water on site. Oceanics brings that big vision down to modules. UN Habitat and a team of engineers and architects set out a kit of hexagonal platforms that can link into villages and then into cities. Each platform is a neighborhood block. A handful make a district with a school, clinic, and market. Add more and you have a small city. The parts travel by barge, bolt together at a protected site, and can be reconfigured when needs change. The topsides host mid-rise buildings, gardens, and public decks. The undersides host shellfish, kelp, and reef frames that boost marine life. Power comes from roof solar, small wind, and wave devices at the edge. Water comes from rain and treatment. Solid waste is sorted at source, with digesters handling organics. The platforms moor within breakwaters sized for local storms. If a threat grows, the city can unclip, tow to shelter, and return. That repeatable logic reduces risk for governments and insurers. It also answers a practical concern. How do you start? You start small, with 3 to 6 platforms, prove services and safety, then scale as trust grows. Koen Olthuis has built the bridge from drawings to households. Through Water Studio and in Dutch consortia, he has delivered floating homes, schools, and public buildings that plug into canals and harbors. The method uses concrete pontoons as foundations. A light superstructure sits on top. Utility lines connect through flexible hoses. The hulls resist ice and wake loads and sit low enough to keep decks stable in wind. Schoonship in Amsterdam shows how this works at the level of a neighborhood. A group of families formed a cooperative, secured a water plot, and installed a set of floating houses tied by a shared jetty. Roofs carry solar panels. A smart microgrid lets neighbors trade power. Heat pumps draw energy from the canal. Water systems separate black water and gray water to make treatment more efficient. The place feels like a street, only the street is water. Kids bike the jetty, kayaks slide off back decks, and barges deliver bulky goods. When a storm passes, the homes rise and fall together, tied to dolphins. The effect is calm and ordinary, which is the point. Floating can feel like normal life. The sea scraper takes the next step and turns floating into a vertical ecosystem. The idea is simple to state and hard to achieve. A tower that floats, produces its own power, grows food, processes waste, and supports a mix of homes and work. Some versions look like inverted pyramids that hang below the surface, with farms and labs submerged and housing above. Others look like slender stems with collars of platforms. Energy could come from solar, wind, wave, and ocean thermal devices. Food could come from aquaculture and hydroponics stacked in the tower. The skin would host sea life, which would help with water quality. The draw is density without land. The risk is engineering and cost. A true sea scraper must handle waves, corrosion, and biofouling, all while staying safe and repairable. It must move enough to ride swells, but not so much that people get sick. It must carry heavy systems without sinking its business case. For now, the sea scraper lives in competitions and labs, but parts of it are in use offshore every day in energy and research. A practical path runs through all of these cases. Treat the platform as the foundation. Make it in a yard where quality can be controlled. Tow it to site. Use standard moorings and flexible service lines. Keep buildings light and compact. Harvest local energy. Close loops on water and waste. Share power in a microgrid. Plan for maintenance from day one. If a part fails, swap it. If a district outgrows a platform, add one. If a location becomes unsafe, move. This is not romance, it is logistics. Picture a small coastal city that expects steady sea level rise within a generation. The city designates a protected basin as a living lab. It installs 3 platforms: housing, services, and food. The housing platform brings 20 homes online for key workers displaced from a flood-prone area. The services platform hosts a clinic, daycare, and a workshop for repairs. The food platform grows greens and shellfish. The cluster plugs into the city grid, but can island during outages. After 2 years, the city measures performance. Energy bills drop, storm impacts decline, and interest grows. A second cluster arrives, this time with classrooms and a community kitchen. A ferry loop links clusters to the tram stop on shore. The city does not wait for crisis. It builds the habit of living with water. Regulation will shape pace and form. Codes must define freeboard, escape routes, fire safety, and access for emergency services. Harbor rules must balance navigation with long-term residents. Finance must adjust to assets that sit on water rather than land. Insurance must price wind and wave risk with better data. None of these are blockers. They are tasks that cities and firms already manage in ports and marinas. The difference is scale and social use. These projects point to one shared lesson. When we accept water as a ground of its own, design shifts. Streets become jetties. Parks become decks with planters and shade. Plazas become harbors that welcome kayaks and ferries. The edge between inside and outside gains steps, ladders, and floating gardens. Life slows a little because movement follows tides and weather. Life also gains resilience because homes and services ride the water rather than drown under it. The city learns to flex. Designers have long asked what would happen if buildings no longer had to stand on the ground. Water is one answer, but air is another. The sky itself has become a field of speculation, and in recent years, a handful of architects have drawn proposals that move entire settlements into the atmosphere. Glaude's architecture office has offered some of the clearest images of this approach. Their drawings show towers suspended from near-Earth orbiting asteroids, vast structures that hang like pendulums into the sky, touching the atmosphere without ever resting on land. At first glance, the idea seems like fantasy, but it asks serious questions. If buildings could rise into the sky, leaving the land below open, how might that change the way we think about cities, nature, and the role of architecture itself? The proposal called Analemma Tower is the most striking. The vision begins with the capture of an asteroid in a controlled orbit. From that orbital anchor, a cable would hang down toward the planet, and attached to it would be a tower several kilometers tall. The tower would not sit on the Earth at all. Instead, it would hover, moving with the orbital path, drifting across continents and oceans. Life in such a tower would be shaped by altitude, agriculture near the base, homes at middle levels, and observation decks near the top where gravity weakens and the horizon bends. Power would come from the sun, collected by vast arrays above the cloud line. Water would be harvested from condensation and rain systems. Waste would be processed internally and released only as clean output. The entire system would be closed, suspended, and independent. This idea is not only about engineering, it carries a clear philosophical charge. By removing settlement from the ground, the tower restores the land to nature. Forests, wetlands, and fields could grow without the pressure of roads, foundations, or sprawl. The very act of leaving the soil untouched becomes an act of repair. In this way, erasing the ground is not an act of denial, but of healing. The human presence shifts upward, leaving space for ecological recovery. Imagine a valley now filled with farms and towns. In the sky above, a suspended city passes. The valley slowly rewilds, rivers move more freely, and species return. People still live nearby, but not on top of the land. Architecture here does not dominate, it withdraws. Suspended buildings also change how we think about movement and time. A city that floats in orbit does not stay still. Its inhabitants live with a constant drift. One day the tower passes over deserts, the next over oceans, the next over forests. This movement can be predictable, tied to orbital mechanics, but it also makes daily life different. The ground beneath is always changing, so orientation must come from within the structure. Schools, markets, and homes form the anchors of meaning, not the terrain. Inhabitants learn to see the earth as a panorama, not as a foundation. This shift alters identity. Where ground once provided stability, the sky now offers perspective. The community defines itself not by place, but by shared motion. A more practical path toward sky settlements comes from lighter-than-air structures. Airships and aerostats have long shown that vast platforms can float when filled with lighter gases. Architects have drawn visions of airborne cities made of linked balloons, each supporting housing pods and service decks. Solar panels cover upper surfaces. Vertical shafts connect sky decks with hanging gardens. Such cities could hover at chosen altitudes, moving slowly with prevailing winds. Unlike ground cities, they leave no scar when they depart. A valley or coast visited by a sky settlement can return to its earlier state once the structure drifts on. This reversibility makes the idea appealing in a time when resilience and adaptability matter. Consider a region facing desertification. Instead of building new towns that consume scarce water, a community might invest in a sky settlement that floats overhead. Residents farm hydroponic crops in suspended decks, harvest moisture from the air, and store solar power in lightweight batteries. The settlement offers shelter without drawing down the fragile land below. When conditions shift, the city can relocate. The land beneath has a chance to rest, and if rainfall returns, ecosystems may recover. The design thus joins ecological patience with human mobility. The concept of void settlements extends even further. Some architects propose structures built not to occupy air, but to inhabit emptiness itself. Imagine vast frameworks suspended by magnetic fields, or clusters of tethered satellites forming habitable rings. These ideas push the question of ground erasure to its limit. If people can thrive in voids where orientation is free and gravity is optional, the tie to the earth becomes symbolic rather than material. We no longer stand on soil. We hover, drift, or orbit. Daily rituals such as cooking, meeting, or resting still occur, but they unfold in places without weight. This challenges the role of architecture. Instead of anchoring us, it organizes flows of energy, water, and movement in spaces without ground. Some might dismiss these projects as impractical, yet they serve a role. They make visible the hidden assumption that buildings must touch earth. By showing alternatives, however speculative, they open our imagination to different relationships with the planet. In a time when ecological pressures demand new forms of settlement, such imagination matters. It allows us to think beyond repair toward renewal. For instance, if large parts of the Amazon or Congo basin could be freed from settlement, what might that mean for climate stability? A vision of skybound dwellings makes that possibility more vivid. It is not about building tomorrow, but about clarifying choices today. One way to ground this discussion in reality is to look at existing technologies. High-altitude balloons already carry instruments for months. Space stations already host long-term life support. Tether technologies are used in communications and energy. Each of these pieces can be seen as a fragment of the larger dream. Even if we never hang towers from asteroids, we may yet build airborne campuses for research or floating dormitories that relieve pressure on crowded ground cities. We may use sky platforms as mobile shelters in disaster zones. Where land is flooded or destroyed, these limited uses show that the leap to sky is not only fantasy, but also a path with steps. The idea of architecture that erases the ground by leaving it untouched is a radical one, but it forces us to reconsider what architecture is for. Is it only to provide shelter and support, or can it also be a means of withdrawal, a way of giving back space to the earth? Sky settlements take the second path. They hold people aloft, safe and supplied, while returning ground to forests, wetlands, or fields. The air becomes our floor, the sky our terrain. For those inside, this new ground is both abstract and real. It is not soil underfoot, but it is steady enough for life. And in that steady suspension, the old ground below begins to heal. To speak of erasing the ground is not to erase memory or to reject history. It is to question the assumption that architecture must always root itself in soil, that human presence must always mark territory with weight and permanence. Across cultures and centuries, people have already shown other paths. The stilt house in Southeast Asia stands above the floodplain, light on the earth, open to air and water. The Malay house, raised on timber posts, with steep roofs and permeable walls, treats the ground not as property to be conquered, but as a living surface that shifts, breathes, and changes. These houses are not fragile because they are light. They endure because they respond. They can be repaired, extended, or dismantled without ruin. They embody the principle that the ground is not stable and should not be forced into submission. This vernacular wisdom leads naturally to the speculative visions of later centuries. When architects of the 20th century began to dream of floating cities, modular megastructures, and marine settlements, they were not abandoning tradition, but extending it. Kiyonori Kikutake's marine city, with its floating discs that could grow or sink, is a direct heir to the stilt house. Both recognize water as a constant companion and see lightness as strength. The difference is scale. Where the Malay house protects a family from flood, the marine city protects a population from rising seas. The principle remains to live with the environment rather than against it, to build in ways that can adapt, shift, and withdraw. Today, in a time of climate crisis, these principles gain urgency. Vincent Callebaut's lily pad, imagined as a refuge for climate migrants, is a floating ecosystem. Oceania, with UN backing, presents modular water-based communities that can cluster, expand, or disperse. Koen Olthuis designs floating neighborhoods in Amsterdam where each home is buoyant, moored, yet mobile. The Sea Scraper, a vertical settlement suspended in water, takes the principle further, envisioning an entire world below the waves. These projects are not science fiction. They are responses to the fact that coastlines are vanishing, storms are intensifying, and millions will be displaced. By floating, architecture becomes both a sanctuary and a signal. It says that permanence in the old sense is gone, but resilience is possible if we build differently. Beyond water, the sky itself becomes the next ground. Cloud's architecture office has imagined towers that hang from orbiting asteroids, drifting across the globe. Lighter than air structures propose airborne campuses and settlements, suspended above the land, leaving valleys and forests below untouched. Here, ground erasure becomes a form of ecological repair. By lifting human life into the air, soil and ecosystems are allowed to recover. The act of not building on land is itself an act of building for the planet. To live in the sky is to admit that the ground must be given space to heal. In this view, architecture does not only shelter people, it shelters the earth. Lebbeus Woods pushed this idea into the realm of philosophy with his concept of free space. His drawings show structures that float without anchor, Space is defined not by foundations, but by interactions. Free space is not emptiness, it is possibility. It is the refusal to dictate form from the ground up. In such spaces, architecture becomes less about stability and more about openness. It becomes a medium for imagination and exchange, a field where meaning emerges from use rather than from fixed order. This too is a kind of erasure, the erasure of determinism, the erasure of the ground as law. What remains is freedom, but also responsibility. Without the anchor of soil, humans must define their relations in new ways. Taken together, these examples form a lineage. The stilt house, the Malay house, the marine city, the floating community, the sky tower, and the free space drawing are not isolated curiosities. They are steps in a continuous exploration of what it means to live without pressing into the ground. The thread that connects them is not only technical, but also ethical. To erase the ground is to resist domination. It is to refuse the impulse to fix, to fence, to mark territory as conquered. It is to accept impermanence, to live lightly, to treat the earth not as foundation, but as companion. At times it is also an act of wonder, for to hover above water, to drift in air, or to inhabit voids is to feel the strangeness of being alive in a vast world. Imagine a city where the riverbanks are free of concrete walls because people live on floating terraces. The water rises and falls, and life rises with it. Imagine a forest that stretches without interruption because nearby settlements hover above in aerostatic clusters. The trees grow tall, animals return, and people look down not as owners but as neighbors. Imagine seas once considered uninhabitable, now holding buoyant communities, able to move with storms rather than be destroyed by them. These are not dreams of escape, but of return. They return to a mode of building that accepts change, that sees instability not as a threat, but as a condition of life. A manifesto of ground erasure would declare that architecture must release its obsession with the solid base. It must see the ground as something to respect, not to consume. It must draw from traditions where lightness is wisdom and extend them into futures where survival depends on adaptability. It must use technology not to impose permanence, but to create mobility, reversibility, and resilience. It must allow the land to rest, the water to flow, the air to carry, and the void to open. To erase the ground in this sense is not to deny the earth, but to honor it. It is to step back, to hover, to float, to drift, and in doing so, to rediscover both freedom and care. Such a manifesto does not promise utopia. It accepts risk, instability, and change, but it insists that the old model of permanence and domination is no longer viable. The ground cannot bear the weight of endless foundations, highways, and sprawl. Erasure, paradoxically, becomes preservation. By lifting, lightening, and releasing, architecture can help restore balance. The act of not building on the ground becomes as meaningful as building itself. To live in this way is to live with humility, with resilience, and with imagination. It is to see architecture not as a mark upon the earth, but as a dance above it.